Imagine waking up to find your village buried beneath snow so deep that roads vanish. Food runs dangerously low, and the only warmth comes from a single fire that must last for weeks. In the Middle Ages, winter storms were not just cold weather. They were battles for survival. Tonight, we'll explore how ordinary people endured these endless winters, relying on food stores, faith, and sheer resilience. Stay with me as we step quietly into their world, where every snowfall brought new challenges, and every thaw carried the hope of spring. Chapter 1. The First Frost and the Coming of Winter. When the first frost spread across the medieval fields, it was more than just a shift in weather. It was a signal, a quiet announcement that the struggles of winter were about to begin. For people in the Middle Ages, winter was not a season of cozy firesides and holiday cheer, but one of fear, preparation, and endless endurance. Every gust of icy wind carried with it the possibility of hunger, sickness, and death. You must imagine the rhythm of the medieval year as a cycle dictated by the land. Farmers and villagers knew their survival depended on the months leading up to winter. Harvest season in autumn was not simply a time of abundance. It was a race against time, a desperate attempt to gather enough grain, dry enough meat, and store enough vegetables to carry a household through the dark months ahead. Each sack of barley, each turnip stored in a root cellar, and each salted piece of pork was part of an intricate calculation. Would there be enough to last until spring? The threat of a storm in winter magnified these anxieties. A heavy snow could bury roads, cut off trade, and isolate villages for weeks. Rivers froze, mills stopped turning, and markets shut down. Survival meant turning inward, relying not on commerce or outside help, but on the careful preparations made in late summer and autumn. If a family had miscalculated, if their harvest had been poor, or if pests had destroyed part of their grain, a storm was not just inconvenient, it was potentially deadly. Inside medieval homes, daily life revolved around conserving heat and rationing food. Houses of peasants were often single-room structures, with walls of wattle and daub, or rough stone, and roofs of thatch. The central hearth was the only source of warmth, and smoke filled the air before escaping through holes or cracks in the ceiling. Families would huddle close together for warmth, sometimes sharing space with animals like chickens or goats, whose body heat added to the collective warmth of the home. A storm outside, with its pounding winds and thick snow, meant doors were barred tightly, cracks stuffed with straw, and cloaks and blankets drawn closer. In monasteries, conditions were somewhat different, but no less challenging. Monks, unlike peasants, lived in stone buildings with cloisters and chapels. These spaces offered more protection against the cold, but were equally vulnerable to food shortages and freezing temperatures. Monks rose early for prayer, regardless of the weather. Imagine trudging through a cloister in the middle of a storm. The wind whistling through stone arches, snow creeping across the flagstones. Discipline demanded that the liturgy continue, storm or no storm. And so prayers rose in freezing chapels while the winds outside battered walls, built generations earlier. Food was at the heart of winter survival. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and onions were staples because they kept well in cool, dry storage. Salted fish and preserved meat offered protein, though they were monotonous and sometimes unpleasant after months of eating the same. Bread made from stored grain was the daily anchor, though scarcity often meant stretching flour with rye, oats, or even ground acorns when supplies ran low. During a storm, when travel and hunting were impossible, families relied entirely on these stores. Yet storms brought more than hunger, they brought danger. Roofs could collapse under the weight of snow, and frozen water supplies meant long walks to rivers or wells, often made treacherous by ice. Fires were another hazard. With everyone huddled inside and fuel scarce, sparks from a crowded hearth could ignite thatched roofs. Entire villages had been lost to fires in the dead of winter. There was also the psychological toll. Imagine days without sunlight, the sound of the storm howling endlessly, the walls of a cottage rattling under the strain of the wind. Time itself seemed to stretch, each day blending into the next. For people of faith, winter storms were often interpreted as divine tests. Preachers spoke of storms as punishments for sin, or as reminders of humanity's smallness against the vast power of God. Yet faith also offered comfort. Prayers, chants, and rituals provided rhythm and meaning to what otherwise might have felt like endless suffering. When a storm ended, relief was mixed with dread. Snow still covered the fields, paths were blocked, and supplies were depleted. The storm might be over, but winter itself remained, and survival was always a question of whether the stores would hold. Still, there was resilience. Children played in the snow, despite the cold. Families shared stories by the fire. Neighbors offered what little help they could spare, knowing that next time they might be the ones in need. Survival was not just about food or warmth, but about community, a fragile web of relationships stretched thin by storms, yet enduring all the same. And so, each storm was both a trial and a teacher. It reminded medieval people of the limits of their control, the importance of preparation, and the shared bonds of survival. But it also raised a question that lingered in every household after the winds quieted. If another storm came before spring, would they be ready? Chapter 2. Preparing for the storms, food, shelter, and survival tactics. When you think of winter preparation today, you might picture central heating, supermarkets, or weather forecasts that predict storms days in advance. In the Middle Ages, preparation for winter was none of these things. It was a year-long process, woven into farming cycles, community cooperation, and a deep knowledge of nature. For most medieval households, the difference between survival and starvation during the storm was determined months earlier, when the harvest was brought in and decisions were made about what to store, what to consume, and what to sell. The medieval pantry was a carefully curated arsenal against hunger. Grain was the most vital resource, as bread formed the foundation of daily diets. Peasants dried and stored grain in sacks or bins, often hidden away in lofts or granaries to protect them from damp and rodents. Oats, barley, and rye were common, while wheat was a luxury in many rural areas. Grain was ground into flour at mills, but in the middle of the storm, mills powered by rivers often froze, leaving households to rely on flour prepared earlier. Some villagers kept hand querns, small grinding stones, as a backup, though these were tiring to use and produced only coarse flour. Vegetables were equally important. Root cellars or pits dug into the earth kept turnips, parsnips, carrots, and onions cool and edible for months. Cabbages were salted or fermented into sauerkraut, which provided vital nutrition in the absence of fresh grains. Dried peas and beans were stored in clay jars, their longevity making them a dependable source of protein long after harvest. Herbs, too, were dried in summer and hung from rafters, ready to season bland winter stews or to be brewed into teas. Believed to help with winter ailments, meat was a rare but prized commodity. Only wealthier households or monasteries could afford to slaughter animals specifically for food. Peasants usually ate meat only on feast days or when an animal was too old to work. Still, preparations were made. Pigs were slaughtered in late autumn, and the meat salted, smoked, or dried to last through the cold months. Fish was equally significant. In coastal and river regions, families dried or salted fish in bulk, while monasteries in particular relied on preserved fish for fasting days when meat was forbidden. Honey was treasured as both food and preservative. It sweetened dishes in a world before widespread sugar, and could keep fruits edible in sealed jars. Hard cheeses, aged for months, were another staple, dense, calorie-rich, and resistant to spoilage. In wealthier households, wine and ale were brewed in autumn, both as a safer alternative to water and as a way to preserve calories in liquid form. Fuel for heating was as important as food. Wood was gathered all year, but winter storms demanded careful rationing. Not every home had a forest nearby, and cutting wood in the dead of winter was dangerous. Peat, dried from bogs during summer, was another source of fuel, though it produced thick smoke. In towns, poorer families often scavenged twigs, dung, or crop stubble for burning. Larger homes and monasteries stockpiled fuel in dedicated sheds. Planning for storms that might make travel impossible, clothing was another line of defense. Wool was the main material, spun into thick cloaks, tunics, and hose. It was durable, warm even when damp, and available across much of Europe. Layering was the medieval answer to insulation. Linen underclothes, wool tunics, and heavy cloaks, layered together, kept the cold at bay. Fur from rabbits, foxes, or sheep added warmth but was expensive and often reserved for the wealthy. Children were often wrapped in whatever scraps of wool or linen could be spared, sometimes even old sacks stitched into makeshift garments. Boots lined with straw or moss offered insulation against snow, while mittens, though rare, were sometimes made from leather or thick cloth. Shelter played its role too. Peasant cottages were crude by modern standards, but were built with winter in mind. Thick thatched roofs shed snow, and mud and straw walls retained heat better than bare wood. Still, drafts and leaks were common. Families stuffed gaps with rags, moss, or hay, doing their best to seal out icy winds. Floors, often bare earth, grew damp in storms, so rushes or straw were laid down to keep feet dry. Animals were sometimes brought inside, a practical decision that meant both warmth and protection of valuable livestock. The smell may have been strong, but the benefit of extra heat was undeniable. For monasteries, preparation took on a more communal and organized form. Large granaries, fish ponds, and brewing facilities meant monks could produce, preserve, and store food on a scale larger than ordinary villagers. Still, even monasteries had to ration during severe winters, and monks sometimes shared their stores with surrounding villages, both out of charity and necessity. Their stone structures were more durable against storms, yet harder to heat, making cloisters and dormitories bone-chillingly cold in winter. Monastic rules often forbade fires in sleeping areas, meaning monks endured nights with little more than woolen blankets and communal warmth. Beyond food, fuel, and clothing, there was another essential element of winter preparation: community. Medieval people did not survive storms alone. Villages pooled resources, exchanged food, and shared labor. Neighbors looked in on one another, especially the elderly or infirm. During a storm, if a roof collapsed or a family's food ran short, others stepped in when possible. This mutual support was not just kindness, it was survival. Because when the storm passed, no village could afford to lose too many of its members. Yet, preparation was always a gamble. No matter how much food was stored, how much wood was stacked, or how tightly homes were sealed, nature's power remained. Unpredictable, a single storm could undo months of work. Heavy snow might block access to stored supplies in outbuildings. Floods from melting ice could ruin grain stores, and illness could sweep through households weakened by cold and hunger. Preparation, then, was not a guarantee, but a ritual. It was the rhythm of medieval life: harvesting, preserving, mending, storing, and praying. Each family hoped they had done enough, and each storm tested their efforts. Still, one question lingered, year after year, as families braced for the next storm. Would all this preparation be enough, or would nature's fury outmatch their fragile defenses? Chapter 3. Enduring the storm, hardship, faith, and the fragile return of spring. When the first snow fell, it was rarely cause for alarm. Children played in it, farmers took note of its weight on rooftops, and travelers delayed their journeys until the roads cleared. But when the snow kept falling, day after day, Piling higher than the hedgerows and burying the paths between villages, winter ceased to be picturesque. It became a test. Inside homes, darkness set in. Small windows admitted little light, and snow could block even that. Candles and oil lamps were precious, their light rationed as carefully as food. Families gathered in the single warmest space, often around the hearth where cooking, mending, and sleeping blurred together. Privacy vanished. At night, with winds rattling thatch and frost creeping along walls, even the bravest souls prayed that the roof would hold. Hunger sharpened every sound. The scraping of spoons against empty bowls, the crunch of stored grain dwindling, the silence when no meat was left, all were reminders of winter's power. Meals became thinner, stretched with water, or bulked with whatever could be found. Bread might contain more bran than flour, turning it dense and bitter. Pottage, the peasant's staple stew, grew increasingly plain, often little more than cabbage, peas, or turnips boiled in thin broth. In desperate times, foraged foods like acorns or tree bark entered the pot. Their taste harsh but better than nothing, illness thrived in these conditions. The cold weakened bodies, and cramped quarters spread coughs, fevers, and chills swiftly. Respiratory ailments, joint pains, and stomach illnesses were common. Physicians were scarce in rural areas, and most people relied on herbal remedies handed down orally. A tea of elderflower, honey, or thyme might soothe a cough, while garlic was thought to ward off infection. Still, when illness struck during a storm, families could do little more than endure. Faith became a lifeline. Storms were not merely weather. They were seen as divine trials or punishments. Church bells, when they could be rung, echoed through snow to remind villagers of God's presence. Priests prayed for mercy, monks chanted psalms in stone-cold chapels, and households whispered their own petitions in the flickering glow of firelight. For many, faith gave meaning to suffering and hope that spring would eventually return. Monasteries, better supplied than peasant homes, became havens during the harshest storms. Villagers sometimes sought shelter there, receiving bread or fish from the monks' stores. Yet monasteries were not immune to hardship. Storms disrupted their routines of prayer and labor, froze cloisters into icy corridors, and left the monks huddled together for warmth. Their libraries and scriptoria, places of fragile parchment and ink, risked damage from damp, making winter storms enemies not only of bodies but of books. Meanwhile, animals bore their own trials. Cattle lowed in cramped byres, horses stamped restlessly, and chickens ceased laying. Some livestock died in the cold, their carcasses salvaged for meat. Others weakened from poor fodder, making them less useful come spring. Farmers knew that the survival of their animals was as crucial as their own. Without oxen to plow or sheep to shear, the year ahead promised ruin. Outside, the storm transformed the world. Roads vanished under drifts, fields froze solid, and rivers turned to ice. Travel was impossible. Villages became islands, isolated for weeks at a time. Even when storms abated, venturing out was perilous. Snow concealed ditches and fences, and collapsing ice posed dangers near rivers or ponds. Messengers sometimes attempted the journey between towns, but many never returned, their bodies lost to the white silence. Time itself felt suspended. With little work possible, days blurred into one another. Families told stories, sang songs, or carved wood to pass the hours. Women spun wool or mended garments. Children learned simple chores, and men repaired tools by the fire. Yet monotony weighed heavily, and tempers sometimes frayed under the strain of confinement. Winter storms tested not just bodies, but patience and spirit. Eventually, storms broke. Snow melted, roofs dripped, and faint tracks appeared across the thawing ground. Relief was mixed with dread, for the damage was revealed. Stores might be empty, animals thin, homes in need of repair. In some years, storms lasted so long that famine followed, reshaping entire communities. Famines in the 14th century, for example, were worsened by brutal winters that delayed planting and ruined reserves. Survivors remembered such years as scars on their memory, warning future generations of winter's unpredictability. But there was always spring. However fragile, however late, it returned. The thaw revealed green shoots, rivers flowed again, and markets reopened. Fields were plowed, seeds were sown, and routines resumed. People spoke of storms as stories, the great snow of that year, or the winter when the roofs collapsed. Survival became not just a fact, but a shared memory, passed down through families and villages. In the end, winter storms in the Middle Ages were not just meteorological events. They were crucibles that shaped resilience, faith, and community. People emerged from them altered, thinner, perhaps weaker, but also more deeply aware of the delicate balance between preparation and chance. The storms carved into memory the truth that life was fragile, but perseverance was possible. And so, each spring carried an unspoken question. After surviving one winter, would the next demand even more? And so, as the last embers of the medieval hearth faded, people waited patiently for spring, finding strength in small routines and quiet endurance. Thank you for spending this time with me here on Quiet Boring Sleep. If you found this story calming or comforting, I'd be grateful if you could like this video and share it with a friend who might also enjoy drifting off to these quiet corners of history. Wishing you a peaceful night, and until next time, may your sleep be as steady as the fires that kept the Middle Ages warm.